Hi everyone, I'm Shelley and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another reading from Paradise Found, and today I'm going to be reading from Part 6, Chapter 2, The Bearing of Our Results on the Study of Ancient Literature. Now before I start reading, I just want to leave a caveat that just because I am reading this to you does not mean that I agree with everything the author is saying. He tries very, very hard in this chapter to discount what we know to be the biblical cosmology of other civilizations from, centuries ago, because it doesn't fit with his own ideas of the shape of the earth. So just keep that in mind as I am reading this, that I don't necessarily agree with him. I'm just sharing what he has to say. And the Greeks, who surpassed all men in ingenuity, appropriated to themselves the greater part of these things, exaggerating them, and adding to them various ornaments which they wove into this foundation in every style, in order to charm by the elegance of the myths. Hence Hesiod and the famed cyclic poets drew their theogonies, their gigantomachies, their mutilations of the gods, and in hawking them about everywhere they have supplanted the true narrative. And our ears, accustomed to their fictions, familiar to us for several centuries past, guard as a precious deposit the fables which they received by tradition. As I remarked when I began to speak, and rooted by time, this belief has become so difficult to dislodge that to the greater number the truth appears like a story told for amusement, while the corruption of the tradition is looked upon as the truth itself. Philo of Byblos. Summing up the most probable results of all his investigations, Darwin states as his opinion that man must be considered as descended from a hairy quadruped furnished with a tail and pointed ears, probably arboreal in his habits, and an inhabitant of the Old World. According to Haeckel, this Homo primigenius was a blackish, woolly-haired, prognathous ape-like being, with a long, narrow head. His body was entirely covered with hair, and he was unable to speak. In reading most fashionable writers upon ancient mythology and literature, one would think that they conceived of the writers of the Vedic hymns and the authors of the myths of classic literature as very early and but slightly developed descendants of this hairy Homo darwinius. Thus, according to Mr. Keary, at the time that the myth of the Cyclops originated, men really believed that the stormy sky was a being and the sun his eye. Indeed, it might almost appear from another passage in the same book that at the period when this Cyclops faith was reached, men had arrived at quite an advanced stage as compared with the earlier one, when as yet they knew too little to look up at the sky at all, and had an idea that the branches of the trees extended quite to heaven. The power of gazing upward to heaven, he says, came to us not all at once, but gradually, through lapse of time. Savages are said scarcely ever to raise their eyes, and their heads are naturally inclined with a downward gaze, so that it must be an effort for them to look at the sky and the heavenly bodies. Primeval man lived upon roots and berries, or on the lesser animals and the vermin which he gathered from the soil, and so habit as well as nature kept his eyes fixed upon the ground. We need not therefore wonder if, in their half-glances upward, our forefathers had not leisure to observe that the tree-top was not really close against the sky. They may well have deemed that the upper branches hid themselves in infinitely remote ethereal regions. The work which such men make in interpreting ancient literature and thought is strange enough. The ascription to Agni of the same supreme worship which the bard has just paid to Varuna or Mitra is explained as due to the extreme shortness of the memory of early men. Only a knowledge of a most limited portion of the earth's surface can be conceded to any of the ancient nations. The early Aryans sing of the ocean and of ships of 100 oars, but it must not for a moment be supposed that they had ever seen or heard of the real ocean. They had simply originated in their imaginations a mythical one. In such lands, the immortal Iliad becomes merely a tale of land battle, the theater of whose action is limited to the two shores of the Aegean, the known world of the Greek. Though the Homeric poems betray in various places an acquaintance with astronomy and actually name various constellations. Yet, when the question is raised as to how the poet conceived of the return of the sun during the night from the west to the east, even Mr. Bunbury silences us, telling us that in Homer's day nobody had ever thought of such a question. Illustrations of this worse than medieval ignorance and distortion of ancient thought and language could be multiplied to almost any extent. But as some selection must be made, it may perhaps be best to confine ourselves to 3 or 4 points in a field comparatively familiar to all readers likely to peruse these pages, the field of Homeric cosmology. If we succeed according to our expectation, we shall make it plain that those interpreters of Homer whose conceptions of Greek culture are derived from current Darwinistic anthropology rather than from the poems themselves demonstrate by the number and character of their exegetical entanglements the entire incorrectness of their fundamental assumption. Number 1. The question just touched upon, the movement of the sun, is as good as any with which to begin, and by which to show the embarrassments into which accepted interpreters have continually fallen in consequence of denying to the ancients a knowledge of the spherical figure of the earth. Opening Kitely, we find the customary assertion that, according to the ideas of the Homeric and Hesiodic ages, the earth was a round, flat disk, around which the river ocean flowed. Then he says that men, seeing the sun rise in the east and set in the west each day, were naturally led to inquire how his return to the east was effected. He alludes to the fact that in the Odyssey, when Helios ends his diurnal career, he is said to go under the earth. But he adds that it is not easy to determine whether the poet meant that he then passed through Tartarus back to the east during the night. The beautiful fiction of the solar cup or basin he thus describes: if then, as there is reason to suppose, it was the popular belief that a lofty mountainous ring ran round the edge of the earth, it was easy for the poets to feign that on reaching the western stream of ocean Helios himself, his chariot and his horses were received into a magic cup or boat made by Hephaestus, which, aided by the current, conveyed him during the night round the northern part of the earth, where his light was only enjoyed by the happy Hyperboreans, the lofty Rhypharians, concealing it from the rest of mankind. They must also have supposed that the cup continued its course during the day, compassing the earth every 24 hours. Of this fiction, however, Kitely confesses, neither Homer nor Hesiod evinces any knowledge. After quoting various later poets, therefore, he concludes as follows: from a consideration of all these passages, it may seem to follow that the ideas of the poets on this subject were very vague and fleeting. Perhaps the prevalent opinion was that the sun rested himself and his weary steeds in the west and then returned to the east. By what passage, however, whether via the north or underneath the supposed flat disk of the earth, Kitely makes no further effort to determine. The difficulty in the way of supposing that in Homer's thought the nocturnal sun passed underneath the flat earth disk, through Tartarus, back to the east, is that the poet invariably represents this underworld as forever unvisited by sunlight. In view of this, and of the ominous silence of Homer as to any winged cup sailing round the earth in the north, some interpreters warn us against expecting any consistency of thought in poetry so primitive. Schwenk goes so far in this direction as to suggest that the island Ai is a creation of the imagination in the far west, called forth for the express purpose of giving the mind a kind of resting place, where it can leave the sinking Helios without troubling itself with inconvenient speculations as to how he is to get back to the Orient at the appointed hour. He says the Homeric poetry could not allow the sun and the daylight to rest during the night in the Homeric Hades, for in that case Hades would have been illuminated. It therefore supposes an island afar off at the end of the world, where Helios and Dawn, after they have passed over across the heavens, repose at night, and whence after this repose they in the morning again ascend the sky. An exact explanation as to how they come westwardly to this island, and then in the morning rise in the east, less aloof from the poetry. For in Homer nothing of systems is to be found, and only each object taken by itself is correct and clear. Assume once a spherical earth, and all these difficulties of the interpreters are at an end. East and west touch each other. Mr. Gladstone, before abandoning fully the flat earth theory, came as near the truth as he possibly could and not hit it. When speaking of Helios, he wrote, "The fact of his sporting with the oxen night and morning goes far to show that Homer did not think of the earth as a plane, but round, perhaps as upon a cylinder, and believed that the west and east were in contact." Just going to interject here that it does also happen on a circular plane. And that's where I believe this author is mistaken. He mistook, however, in suggesting Thrinakia as the place of contact. It was rather on the meridian of Ai, for we are expressly told that there are the abodes and dance grounds of Aurora, there the risings of the sun. Nor could anything be more natural than that the poet, conceiving of the world of living men as Homer did, and sending out his thoughts eastward and westward in search of the meeting place of evening and morning, should fix upon the meridian opposite his own, the very place and only place where his eastward journeying thought and his westward journeying thought would of necessity meet. His eastern hemisphere would naturally extend round eastward, until it met the edge of the hemisphere extending round westward. On that farthest off meridian, therefore, he made the old day give place to the new, eve to morn. That was the doubtful line on which Odysseus and his companions were no longer clear. Where was east and where was west? Where Helios went behind the earth, or where he rose again? Number 2. The false assumption that Homer's earth is flat has created all the noted controversies connected with his representations of the location of Hades. This question has divided Homeric interpreters into more than a dozen differing camps. Their mutually contradictory solutions of the problem would be the laughingstock of the opposers of classical studies, were these latter only sufficiently acquainted with the world's scholarship to be aware of their existence. To review and solve the question in this place would detain the general reader too long, but in the appendix, section 6, the assertions here made will be found abundantly verified. Number 3. The same flat earth assumption is further responsible for all the difficulties which interpreters have found in representing the ocean, and in general the water system of the earth, in accordance with the Homeric data. These difficulties have been neither few nor small. 4 of them we will here notice. And first, that growing out of the statement that from deep flowing ocean flow all rivers in every sea, and all fountains in deep wells. Volker pronounces this hard to explain, he says. An immediate instreaming of the ocean into the sea can scarcely be meant, partly because sea water and ocean water do not unite, partly because Homer knows of no such instreamings in the Phasis and at the Pillars of Hercules, and the origination of rivers in this way would not be unthinkable. Other writers, devoted to the illustration of ancient thought, seem not to have stopped to inquire whether rivers flowing upstream from the ocean to the hills were thinkable or not, and have gravely set before the youthful student diagrams constructed on this plan as the true representation of Homeric thought. A second embarrassing question has been this. If the ocean stream surrounded and constituted the outermost boundary of the earth disk, what sustained the ocean stream itself and constituted its further shore? As Volker says, who on the further side held in the billows of the vast world river, that they did not flow off into the empty spaces of heaven? Was it a narrow strip of the inner earth? Or was it formless chaos, or the descending rim of the sky, or the inner power of the waters themselves? Buchholz says, by what the ocean itself was in turn bounded remains unclear. The childlike imagination of the Homeric age contented itself with that confused Halbverschwomene conception. The most natural answer, specifically from the point of view represented by Buchholz, who with Uckert and others claims that the Homeric heaven was literally metallic, would seem to be Volker's third supposition, namely that the rim of the metallic sky constitutes the outer limit of the ocean stream. This would correspond also with the general notion that the circular disk of the earth divided the hollow sphere of the universe into 2 equal parts. it would also exactly correspond to Flach's curious and elaborate representation of the Hesiodic world in his recent work on the Hesiodic cosmogony. Still further, it would seem best to accord with Homer's language describing the heavenly constellations as bathing in the ocean. On the other hand, however, such a supposition would be incompatible with the Homeric representation that the farther shore presented a suitable landing place, and especially a landing place situated, like that of Odysseus, in the underworld. Moreover, it would be incompatible with the current notion that the Homeric heaven was supported upon mountain pillars, standing on the earth inside the ocean stream, like Mount Atlas in western Libya. Again, therefore, the question returns. Given a flat earth surrounded by the ocean river, what constitutes the farther shore, and how can the mariner who lands upon it speak of himself as in the underworld? The learned Volker leaves the subject with the unsatisfying observation, "The poet has not yet answered our questions." A third embarrassment dwelt upon by the same advocate of the flat earth theory is that, as he understands Homer, Hellas was the center of the circular earth disk, and not more than 10 or 11 days' sail from the ocean in any direction. And yet the poet makes it 18 days' sail by the shortest route from Ogygia to the land of the Phaeacians, and at least another in the same direction to Hellas, and yet Ogygia is the navel or center of the sea. These, says he, are insurmountable difficulties for him who would measure with the compasses. Rather should we learn from this example what folk faith and folk tales are. Where there is no agreement, we should not create one by main force. The earth is circular and Hellas is its center. That was the popular faith. But the situation of the ocean and the extent of the earth are at the same time such fluctuating ideas, and all anyway extended voyages seem to the poet to extend to such a terrific distance, that it may well happen to him to overpass all bounds out in that realm where were, so to speak, the most terrific of all distances. Thus, the nodding Homer is again caught in contradiction, and to accommodate his exaggerated and terrific distances, even Gladstone at first felt constrained to change the figure of the earth disk itself, and to present it as a vast parallelogram, more extended from north to south than from east to west. The fourth difficulty involved in the current interpretation is that experienced in harmonizing the poet's representations of the ocean, as commonly understood, with his representations of the movements of the sun, as commonly understood. The sun at evening certainly ceases to be visible to men. According to the Homeric representation, he returns to the flowing of the ocean. His bright light sinks in it. At his rising, it is also from the ocean that he begins to mount the sky. Yet his setting is also described as a going under or behind the earth. How now, with a flat circular disk for the earth, and with a circumfluent ocean in the same plane, and with an eternally dark and unsunned Hades just beyond the ocean river to the westward, can these data be harmonized? If we attempt to conceive of the sun as literally sinking in the ocean and hiding his light beneath its waters, he is not gone, but rather in under the ocean. Moreover, the old difficulty reappears as to how he shall get round into the east in time for his rising again. Furthermore, if he is the whole night concealed under the waves of the ocean, descending into it in the far west at his setting, and ascending out of it in the far east at his rising, how can we arrange for his rejoicing himself night and morning with his oxen on the island of Thrinacia? But we cannot abandon this whole supposition, and let the sun set beyond and behind the ocean stream, for that would be in the western Hades, where he never shines. Nor yet again can we say that he descends to the surface of the ocean simply, and then in his cup, or otherwise moves round to the Orient by way of the north, for then, the ocean being in substantially the same plane as the abode of men, they would not be overspread with darkness, but would enjoy, if not the spectacle of the midnight sun, at least the full light of a sun moving round the horizon. On this supposition, too, Hades, just west of the river, would also be equally illuminated. Inside the ocean stream, he certainly does not hide himself in the ground, for that would be incompatible with all the passages associating his rising and setting with the ocean. But if he cannot be conceived of as setting on the hither side of the stream, nor on the farther side, nor yet as resting on the ocean, nor yet as hiding beneath it, what possible conception of the matter remains? All this trouble is the natural result of one false assumption, the assumption that Homer's earth is a flat disk. Assume that it is a sphere, and every one of these difficulties vanishes. Then, in causing the sun to descend to the ocean in which lies Ai, the poet makes the bed to which the king of day retires the same as that from which in the morning he rises again. At the same time, from the poet's standpoint and from the standpoint of the lands inhabited by the poet's countrymen, each setting of the sun was a going behind the earth to reappear on the opposite side. This view of the movement of Helios solves every perplexity, and if Homer had the knowledge of the earth and heavens involved in the view, we may be sure he also knew as well as we do in what sense the ocean is the source of all springs and rivers, and for what reason the equatorial ocean never runs away for the lack of an ultra-terrestrial shore. I'm just going to interject here that the reason the author is having a hard time coming to terms with this is because he is thinking of east and west as just going like this, and he's thinking of the sun moving this way and going underneath, when in fact it's like this. Just as it could start in the same place that it stops the night before on the globe, it could do the same thing on a circle, and he is missing that. Number 4. The same hermeneutical myopia which has thus minified and misconceived every feature of Homer's cosmography has introduced and maintained the now universal dogma that in the Homeric poems Olympus is always the Thessalian mountain of that name. All our youth are taught that the early poets believed that the gods actually lived upon the top of this mountain, separating Macedonia and Thessaly. Even the fable of the giants scaling heaven must be understood in a literal sense. Not that they placed Pelion and Ossa upon the top of Olympus to reach the still higher heaven, but that they piled Pelion on the top of Ossa and both on the lower slopes of Olympus to scale the summit of Olympus itself, the abode of the gods. To settle the question negatively as well as positively, revered German erudition solemnly declares the gods of Homer never live in heaven. Such dogmatism challenges a fresh investigation of the question. Taking up this subject, Kitely remarks that if we were to follow the teachings of comparative mythology, we should have to locate the abode of Homer's gods in the heights of heaven. His language is, were we to follow analogy and argue from the cosmology of other races of men, we would say that the upper surface of the superior hemisphere was the abode of the Grecian gods. He goes on to allude to the conceptions of the Scandinavians and some other peoples and adds, hence we might be led to infer that Olympus, the abode of the Grecian gods, was synonymous with heaven, and that the Thessalian mountain and those others which bore the same name were called after the original heavenly hill. It is a pity that the learned author could not have accepted this very sensible conclusion, but he did not. Rejecting the admitted intimations of comparative cosmology, he says, a careful survey, however, of those passages in Homer and Hesiod in which Olympus occurs will lead us to believe that the Achaeans held the Thessalian Olympus, the highest mountain with which they were acquainted, to be the abode of their gods. The only passage specially referred to by Kitely as establishing this view is the Iliad, where the language employed is not at all inconsistent with the idea that in descending from the summit of Olympus, Hera descended from the northern sky. More elaborate is the argument of Welcker, but its logical cogency is by no means admissible. The true Homeric conception of the abode of the gods is far loftier, grander, and more poetic than that given us by such interpreters. According to the poet's real representation, that abode is the wide heaven, not the atmospheric heaven, for this is a special possession of Zeus. It is the upper sky, the celestial dome, in which sun, moon, and stars wheel silently around the pole. To the early Greek, as to the early Perso-Aryan, it was easy to conceive of this celestial dome as a heavenly mountain, vast, majestic, of unearthly beauty, and peopled with glorious beings invisible to mortals. And this heavenly mountain he called Olympus. The Thessalian mount, the Bithynian, and all the dozen others of the same name, were sacred only so far as they symbolized and commemorated their heavenly original. In the Odyssey, it is plain that Homer speaks of the Thessalian Olympus along with other Thessalian mountains, but in general, he means by Olympus the heights of the northern heaven viewed as the proper abode of the gods. The proofs of the incorrectness of the current interpretation appear on almost every page of the Homeric poems. The designation of the gods by the formula occurs twice in the Iliad and 16 times in the Odyssey, but the expressions who possess the wide heaven in Odyssey and who possess Olympus are plainly identical in meaning. So in the Iliad, the immortals who possess the Olympian mansions and the gods who possess the wide heaven are unquestionably interchangeable phrases. Hence, also the Olympians, the Uranians, and the Epiranians are names of the same beings. In Hesiod's Theogony, the expression within Olympus occurs no less than 3 times. To translate it according to the current interpretation of Homer is to locate the palace of Zeus in the heart of an earthly mountain, and to transform the Lichtgestalten of his heavenly court into trolls. In Book 24 of the Iliad, verse 97, we are told that Iris and Thetis were impelled up to heaven. But the moment the Father of gods and men begins discourse, he says, "Thou hast come to Olympus, O goddess Thetis." And in verse 121 the bard resumes, "Thus he spoke, nor did the silver-footed goddess Thetis disobey, but rushing impetuously, she descended down from the tops of Olympus." One of the most vivid of the pictures of Olympian life in the whole Iliad is that portraying the punishment of Hera by Zeus. In the literal translation of Buckley, it is thus rendered, "O Hera of evil arts, impracticable, thy stratagem has made noble Hector cease from battle, and put his troops to flight. Indeed, I know not whether again thou mayst not be the first to reap the fruits of thy pernicious machinations, and I chastise thee with stripes. Dost thou not remember when thou didst swing from on high, and I hung 2 anvils from thy feet, and bound a golden chain around thy hands that could not be broken? And thou didst hang in the air in clouds, and the gods commiserated thee throughout lofty Olympus. But standing around, they were not able to release thee. But whomsoever I caught, seizing, I hurled from the threshold of heaven till he reached the earth, hardly breathing." Although the words of heaven are supplied by the translator, the contrast required by the expression reached the earth compels the supply in order to make good sense. In Book 1, Hephaestus gives his own account of this same hurling out of heaven. He says, "Be patient, my mother, and although grieved, restrain thyself, lest with my own eyes I behold thee beaten, being very dear to me, nor then, though full of grief, should I be able to assist thee. For Olympian Zeus is difficult to be opposed. For upon a time before this, when I desired to assist thee, having seized me by the foot, he cast me down from the heavenly threshold. The whole day was I hurled, and at the setting of the sun I fell on Lemnos, and but little of life remained in me." Nothing can well be plainer than that this whole scene is conceived of as occurring high in the vault of heaven. To locate it on any many-peaked mountain every way embarrasses the imagination. Moreover, Lemnos is not situated under Thessalian Olympus, nor could the word describe Hephaestus's motion in space from the one to the other. So irresistible indeed is the right interpretation that Keightley, unconscious of his inconsistency, elsewhere says, "The favorite haunt of Hephaestus on earth was the Isle of Lemnos. It was here he fell when flung from heaven by Zeus for attempting to aid his mother Hera." In like manner, Professor Geddes, with a forgetfulness equally entertaining, writes of Zeus hurling Hephaestus over the celestial battlements, and of his being able to draw gods and earth and sea aloft into the sky. The not less famous passage in the opening lines of Book 8 is even more conclusive. Whomsoever of the gods I shall discover, having gone apart from the rest, wishing to aid either the Trojans or the Greeks, disgracefully smitten shall he return to Olympus, or seizing, I will hurl him into gloomy Tartarus, very far hence, where there is a very deep gulf beneath the earth, and iron portals, and a brazen threshold, as far below Hades as heaven is from earth. Then shall he know by how much I am the most powerful of all the gods. But come, ye gods, and try me, that ye may all know. Having suspended a golden chain from heaven, do all ye gods and goddesses suspend yourselves therefrom. Yet would ye not draw down from heaven to earth your supreme counselor Jove, not even if ye labor ever so much, but whenever I, desiring, should wish to pull it, I could draw it up together, earth and ocean and all. Then indeed would I bind the chain around the top of Olympus, and all these should hang aloft. By so much do I surpass both gods and men. Comment is unnecessary. Until the whole of a thing can be suspended upon and supported by a part of itself, no interpreter can make the top of Olympus in this passage signify the top of a mountain in Thessaly. If any further evidence can be needed to show that no mountain of earth can meet the requirements of the language of the Iliad respecting Olympus, it is surely afforded in the passages already alluded to, where suppliants, addressing the gods as Olympian, are said to stretch forth their hands toward the starry heavens. An example of this is the following. But the guardian of the Greeks, Gerenian Nestor, most particularly prayed, stretching forth his hands to the starry heaven, O Father Zeus, if ever any one in fruitful Argus, to thee burning the fat thighs of either oxen or sheep, supplicated that he might return, and thou didst promise an assent, be mindful of these things, O Olympian, and avert the cruel day. Nor is the language of the Odyssey less opposed to the prevailing interpretation. Here Olympus is metaphorically spoken of precisely as we speak of heaven. For Olympus hath given me grief. Again, in a memorable passage, it is depicted in terms which plainly belong to no sublunary sphere. Thus having spoken, blue-eyed Athena departed to Olympus, where they say is forever the firm seat of the gods. It is neither shaken by the winds, nor is it ever bedewed by the shower, nor does the snow approach it, but a most cloudless serenity is spread out, and white splendor runs over it, in which the blessed gods are delighted all their days. To this place Athena departed when she had admonished the damsel. In Book 30, Athena descends from heaven, while in line 55, her return is described as to Olympus. So in line 103, Zeus thunders, but in line 113, the same thundering is described differently. As in the Iliad, so in the Odyssey, suppliants address their prayers toward the starry heaven, and the gods who possess Olympus are called the witnesses on high. So unmistakable is this language and the entire usage of the Odyssey that various recent writers, not emancipated from the traditional view as respects the Iliad, have yet perceived and admitted the identity and the upper in the former work. Among German scholars, Facey and Ina have expressed themselves in this sense, and prominent among the Scotch, Professor Geddes. The latter says, "There is nothing in the Odyssey which obliges us to think of Mount Olympus. Testimony from such a quarter is, of course, all the more convincing." In Homeric thought, then, the abode of the gods was where we should antecedently expect to find it, namely in the heights of heaven. Considered with reference to the august sovereign of gods and men, the polar sky arch was a palace, the royal residence of Zeus. Viewed with reference to its tints, steel blue and gold, it was described as metallic. Terms which metallic interpreters like Voss and Buchholz and Bunbury have pushed to absolute literalness. Conceived of as an ethereal height, it was pictured as a heaven-high mount, snowy as its own white clouds. Then to the climbing imagination, mounting height above height in the vain attempt to reach the summit, the mountain became... My word is indecipherable, I'm sorry. This last description, the Olympus of many layers or thicknesses, is peculiarly expressive. instead of signifying the ridges of mountains or ranges of mountains, as Geddes and so many before him have affirmed. It pictures that world-old conception of a firmament, not single-storied, but with heaven above heaven, to the third or the seventh or the ninth. These heavens were conceived of by Homer himself as in layers, one above another, like the curved laminae of a shield. And what adds to the fitness of the comparison and to the fitness of the cosmic adornment of Achilles' shield is the fact that to the omphalos of a shield there corresponded the central and ever-abiding omphalos of the skies. Number 5. Finally, our larger and more rational interpretation of Homeric ideas beautifully explains the tall pillars of Atlas, and solves the multiform perplexities of the ruling authorities on this question. In approaching the study of this subject, several questions occur to every thoughtful beginner, the answers to which he can nowhere find. For instance, how can Homer speak of the pillars of Atlas, using the plural, when elsewhere in the early Greek mythology the representations always point to only one? Again, if there is but one, and that in the west, near the gardens of the Hesperides, what corresponding supports sustain the sky in the east, the north, and the south? Or, if Atlas's pillar is only one of many similar ones supporting heaven around its whole periphery, how came it to be so much more famous than the rest? Or, if Homer's plural indicates that all of them belong to Atlas, how came the idea of one pillar to be so universally prevalent? If the support of heaven was at many points and at its outermost rim, how could Hesiod venture to represent the whole vault as poised on Atlas's head and hands? Again, if it is the special function of Atlas or of his pillar to stand on the solid earth and hold up the sky, he would appear to have no special connection with the sea. Why, then, should Homer introduce the strange statement that Atlas knows all the depths of the sea? This certainly seems very mysterious. Again, if the office of the pillar or pillars is to prop up the sky, they of course sustain different relations to earth and heaven. They bear up the one, and are themselves borne up by the other. Yet, singularly enough, Homer's Locus Classicus places them in exactly the same relation to the two. Worse than this, Pausanias unqualifiedly and repeatedly asserts that according to the myth, Atlas supports upon his shoulders both earth and heaven. And with this corresponds the language of Aeschylus. But what sort of a poetic imagination is this, which represents a mighty column as upholding not only a vast superincumbent weight, but also and at the same time its own pedestal? Is this a specimen creation of that immortal Hellenic genius, which the whole modern world is taught almost to adore? Turning to the authorities in textual and mythological interpretation, our beginner finds no help. On the contrary, their wild guesses and mutual contradictions only confuse him more and more. Welcker tells him, with all the assuring emphasis of leaded type, that in Atlas is given a personification of the art of navigation, the conquest of the sea by means of human skill, by commerce and the gains of commerce. Preller instructs him to reject this view, and to think of this mysterious son of Iapetus as a sea giant representing the upbearing and supporting almightiness of the ocean, in contrast with the earth-shattering might of Poseidon. The classical dictionaries only perplex him with multitudinous puerilities invented by ignorant euhemeristic scholiasts. Wow. It's a mouthful. Stories to the effect that the original Atlas was merely the astronomer who first constructed an artificial globe to represent the sky, or that he was a Northwest African who, having ascended a lofty promontory the better to observe the heavenly bodies, fell off into the sea, and so gave name both to the mountain and to the Atlantic Ocean. Schoeman does not profess a positive and certain understanding of the matter, but suggests that the mysterious Titan was in all probability originally a gigantic mountain god of some sort. Bryant at first makes Atlas a mountain supporting a temple or temple cave, called Coel, House of God, whence the Coelus of the Romans. In the next volume, however, he says that under the name of Atlas is meant the Atlanteans, and quoting the Odyssey, he translates thus: "They, the Atlanteans, had also long pillars or obelisks, which referred to the sea, and upon which was delineated the whole system both of heaven and earth, all around, both on the front of the obelisk and on the other sides. If our investigator asks, as did an ancient grammarian, how Atlas could stand on the earth and support heaven on his head, if heaven was so far removed that an anvil would require 9 days and nights in which to fall through the distance, Paley kindly explains that the poet's notion doubtless was that Atlas held up the sky near its junction with earth in the far west. In this case, of course, a reasonably short giant would answer the purpose. If after all his consultations of authorities, our youth is still unsatisfied, and to make a last effort for light turns to the illustrious Welker, he learns as an important final lesson that when an ancient author says heaven and earth, it is not for a moment to be supposed that he literally means heaven and earth, and that if they had remembered this, writers on mythology would have spared themselves a vast amount of brain-racking and ineffectual pro and contra pleading. With this as the sole outcome of all his researches, may not a beginner well despair of ever getting any knowledge of the meaning of the myth, if indeed he can still imagine it to have had a meaning? Here, as everywhere, the truth at once explains and removes all the difficulties which a false and groundless presupposition has created. Once conceive of the Homeric world as we have reconstructed it, and how clear and beautiful the conception of the pillars of Atlas becomes. They are simply the upright axis of earth and heaven. Viewed in their relation to earth and heaven respectively, they are two, but viewed in reference to the universe as an undivided whole, they are one and the same. Being coincident, they are truly one, and yet they are ideally separable. Hence, singular or plural designations are equally correct and equally fitting. Transpiercing the globe at the very navel or center of the sea, Atlas's pillar penetrates far deeper than any recess of the water's bed, and he may well be said to know the depths of the whole sea. Or this statement may have reference to that primordial sea, in which his pillar was standing when the geogenic and cosmogenic process began. In this sense, how appropriate and significant would it have been if it applied to Izanagi? Again, the association of Atlas with the gardens of the Hesperides, so far from disproving our interpretation, actually affords new confirmation, since Aeschylus, Pherecydes, and the oldest traditions locate the Hesperides themselves not in the west, but in the extreme north, beyond the Riphean Mountains, in the vicinity of the Hyperboreans. In fact, there are very strong reasons for believing that these gardens of the Hesperides were nothing other than the starry gardens of the circumpolar sky, that therefore the Hesperides were called the daughters of night, and that the great serpent which assisted the nymphs in watching the golden apples was none other than the constellation Draco, whose brilliant constituent Alpha, the astronomer's Thuban, was less than 50 centuries ago the pole star of our heaven. Once more, our interpretation perfectly harmonizes the passages which represent Atlas as a heaven supporter with those which represent him as equally supporting earth. More than this, he reveals the curious fact that Homer's description of the tall pillars of Atlas identifies them with the axes of earth and heaven so unmistakably that in order to blunder into the common mistranslation of it, it was first necessary to invent and get the lexicographers to adopt a span new special meaning for these words, a meaning necessitated by no other passage in the whole body of Homeric Greek. Homer's beautifully explicit language is, who of his own right possesses the tall pillars which have around them earth and heaven. Nowhere in Homeric, if indeed in any ancient Greek, does the expression mean to prop asunder. Finally, as to the supposed difficulty of imagining a heaven upholder so tall that it would take a brazen anvil 9 days and nights to fall from his head to his feet, if Professor Paley had remembered Sandalphon, the Talmudic Atlas, he would hardly have thought it necessary to locate the Hesiodic one on the edge of the earth where the sky is low. Of Sandalphon, Rabbi Eliezer has said There is an angel who standeth on earth, and reacheth with his head to the door of heaven. It is taught in the Mishnah that he is called Sandalphon. He exceedeth his companions as much in height as one can walk in 500 years, and that he stands behind the chariot, and twisteth or bindeth the garlands for his Creator. Atlas's pillar, then, is the axis of the world. It is the same pillar apostrophized in the Egyptian document known as the Great Harris Magic Papyrus, in these unmistakable words: O long column, which commences in the upper and in the lower heavens. It is with scarce a doubt what the same ancient people in their Book of the Dead so happily styled the spine of the earth. It is the umbrella staff of Burmese cosmology, the churning stick of India's gods and demons. It is the trunk of every cosmical tree. It is the shadowless lance of Alexander, the tortoise-piercing or earth-piercing arrow of the Mongolian heaven god, the spear of Izanagi, the hacha de cobre on which the heavens of the Miztecs rested. It is the cord which the ancient Vedic bard saw stretch from one side of the universe to the other. Is it not the psalmist's line of the heavens which has gone out through the very earth and on to the end of the world? It is the Irminsul of the Germans, as expressly recognized by Grimm. It is the Tower of Kronos. It is Plato's spindle of necessity. It is the Azakal of the North African Sunnis. It is the ladder with 7 lamps in the rites of Mithra. It is the Talmudic pillar which connects the paradise celestial and the paradise terrestrial. In the foregoing discussions of Homeric cosmology, we have had a sufficient exhibition of the cause and cure of current malpractice, shall we call it, on the part of interpreters of Homeric poetry. Their baseless assumptions and blunders have been renewed and multiplied in nearly every field of archaeology: Assyrian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, Indian. Whithersoever modern research has gone, it has carried with it, as a kind of first principle and rule of interpretation, the assumption that the early nations cannot possibly have known anything about the world, beyond what undeveloped tribes and peoples would, of necessity, observe within their own contracted boundaries. The inconsistencies of ignorance and of half-knowledge and of an undisciplined, childlike imagination are therefore to be expected at every step. Even the squarest contradictions must not surprise. Indeed, in respect to Homer, the learned Sangabush has actually formulated the universal proposition that the results of investigations in different departments of Homeric study will always be found to contradict each other. In view of the accepted modern results of investigation into Homer's cosmology, one is tempted to justify the proposition, only qualifying it in a mild degree as follows. The results of all Homeric investigations based upon the assumption that Homer was too primitive a man to know where the sun sets will always be found self-contradictory. Against all such barbarizing misinterpretation of ancient literature, it is high time that a protest should be heard. Long enough has the beauty and the breadth of ancient thought in poetry and myth, and even in word building, been obscured and hidden by this conceited assumption of the modern teacher. It was bad enough when the old grammarians, assuming that Homer could have had no idea of other than the nearest waters, mutilated the grand proportions of the Odyssey to fit the voyagings of its hero into the western basin of the Mediterranean, or worse yet, into the Euxine. But this, after all, was an altogether pardonable offense compared with the currently accepted procedure of scholars, who, brought up apparently on magazines of popular science, and imagining that Columbus was the first man to whom the idea ever occurred that the earth is round, approach the study of antiquity merely as the study of an older department of barbarian folklore. Surely it is time to investigate the great creations of ancient mind in a different spirit. It is nothing short of deplorable to consider the mass of senseless argument and false explanation annually crowded into the memories of successive classes of academic and collegiate youth. Arguments and explanations which neither to teacher nor taught have even the poor merit of intelligently illustrating the evils of wrong principles of classical hermeneutics. the discussions and results of the present treatise have at least disclosed a conceivable beginning of human history, according to which the early generations of men can hardly have failed to acquire that knowledge of the mechanism of the heavens which all the oldest tradition of the race ascribed to them. And if, in consequence of the acceptance or even the discussion of the proffered results, the eyes of scholars shall at last once more be directed to the study of the great literary and other artworks of ancient mind in a new and more modest spirit, the gains which are sure to accrue therefrom will be neither few nor small. And that is all for today's chapter. It was a long one, and it was quite a mouthful, and I already expressed my opinion about it at the beginning, so I'm not going to do it again. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one down below. And if you like my work and would like to support my channel, I will leave a link in the description for my YouTube membership, or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.